And the recording has started, Chair Shelby. Chair Shelby, I don't know if you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Oh, and both of the mics are unmuted. Both of the lines that you're calling in on.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, we start with the, so I'll start over again. I'd like to call the March 22nd, 2021 Sacramento County Planning Commission to order. Can we start with the roll call?
Yes. Commissioner Tom?
Here.
Martinson?
Here.
Rathel?
Here.
Chair Shelby?
Here.
And Commissioner Tatishi?
Here.
And you have a quorum.
Start with the opening statement.
And in compliance with the directives of the county, state, and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this meeting is live streamed and closed to in-person public participation. Temporary procedures are subject to change pursuant to guidelines related to social distancing and minimizing person-to-person contact. To make a verbal comment at today's meeting, dial 916-875-2500. Follow the prompts to be placed in queue for a specific agenda item or off-agenda matter. When the chair opens public comment for a specific agenda item or off-agenda matter, callers will be transferred from the queue into the meeting to make a verbal comment. Written comments are always accepted. Feel free to send your email comment to boardclerk@saccounty.net, and your comment will be routed to the board and filed in the record.
Okay, and we can start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I believe on number 2, we're asking for to continue it to a later date. We can start number 2 if that's the case.
Yes, that's correct. Should I just read it into the record, you said?
I think we need to vote on it, right?
Yes, you don't need to vote.
So, yeah. So let's start number 2 and then we'll go number 1.
Sounds good. Item number 2 is for a development plan review located at 14805 Reynosa Drive, approximately a third of a mile east of the Murrieta South Parkway and Jackson Road intersection in the Cosumnes community. And the environmental doc is prior environmental impact report and mitigation monitoring and reporting program.
Okay. And what day we're moving it to again?
And this item will be continued to April 12th.
Okay, move to continue to April 12th. Motion.
I'll second. This is Kara.
Thank you, Kara. Okay. Commissioner Tom?
Yes.
Martinson?
Yes.
Rathel?
Yes.
Tatishi?
Yes.
And Chair Shelby?
Yes.
And the motion passes. This item will be heard on the 12th.
Okay, we can call number 1 now. Thank you.
Perfect. 3:04 p.m. And item number 1 is a general plan annual report. 2030 general plan annual report for calendar year 2020, and item of documentation is not applicable in this case.
Good evening, Commissioners. Todd Smith here, Principal Planner, here to give the presentation on this year's General Plan Annual Report. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly cover some of our major programs and projects this year, starting with the environmental justice element. 2020 was the first full year rather of implementation of the phase 2 environmental justice element. You have in your package what we call the EJ report card that contains a lot of detail on the individual policies and implementation measures that we've done over the last 12 months. I do want to highlight that we have convened the executive level working group that's identified in the implementation section of the EJ element. And we have done some limited stakeholder outreach this year with the pandemic. It's been a bit of a challenge, but we are excited about some of the activities we're carrying out under the EJ element, and particularly the Re-Envision West Arden Arcade project, which is detailed in the annual report as attachment 1. We've also done a lot of work on the. Go ahead.
I was going to add just one thing too, Todd. So we're not taking action on this today. We're receiving and following it. So I was going to say
that's correct.
Questions as we go through. We'll just ask the questions as we go through the presentation versus waiting at the end today. That's the only thing.
Yes, thank you. That's a good reminder. This is a receive and file. There is no action requested on this item. So the community-wide climate action plan, we had previously had this project on hold, but we in 2020 did reinitiate work with our consultant, conducted several stakeholder group meetings with representatives from environmental interest groups and development community, including the Building Industry Association and the Sacramento Region Builders Exchange and a few others. Those are all obviously online meetings, but we are happy to say as of today, actually this is actually a couple weeks ago, the public review draft climate action plan is out for public review for a 30-day review period. So we're making really good progress there. And that would come back to the Planning Commission in the next couple of months after we go through the review process and refine the draft as we move through the hearing process. On the South Sacramento Habitat Conservation Plan, there's been a lot of work done by our environmental review team on implementation of that HCP as it relates to permit issuance and getting some of the processes up and running. We've actually issued a couple of project-specific permits under the HCP this year. Next slide, please. As it relates to the housing element, this is the 7th year of the Cycle 5 housing element, 2013 to 2021. I've got a couple tables in the following slides, but we have been doing a lot of work on the housing element update this calendar year, which is the 2021 to 2029 housing element update. We do anticipate that coming to the board later this summer. Obviously, it'll be back at the Planning Commission before it goes on to the board, but we have submitted the draft housing element update to State Department of Housing and Community Development. They're in for their review process right now. We expect to get comments back within the next several weeks, hopefully. We have been doing a lot of work under the SB2 planning grant. That includes a number of amendments to the zoning code, the design guidelines, and then any relevant changes in the general plan policies so that we have internal consistency among all of those guiding documents. We're also continuing work on the rezone program. For those who aren't up to speed on that, this is something that we are doing as a part of the housing element implementation in order to ensure sufficient availability on our multifamily inventory for residential development as required as part of the housing element. And I want to say the SB2 effort, at least the general plan, zoning code, and design guideline amendments would be coming to the Planning Commission toward the end of this year, perhaps I'll just say fall as a general frame of reference. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of where we're at in the current regional housing needs allocation cycle, cycle 5. We've got years 1 through 7 in the middle of the chart here, and then the income levels on the left side, so very low, low, moderate, above moderate. This shows our progress through this cycle of producing units in each of these income level categories. You can see here that the low and very low income level production has remained very low. We are making some progress on moderate and above moderate, but at the end of the day, that far right column and the remaining RENA is still pretty high. And Sacramento County is not alone in this. Many jurisdictions, in fact, most jurisdictions throughout the state are in a similar position in terms of permitting residential units. And I want to clarify, when we say permitted residential units, that doesn't mean entitled. It means actual building permits issued. So there may be a number of projects that have gone through the entitlement process, been approved for the income level in the residential category, but they may not have come in for building permits yet. Next slide, please. And this is what we're looking at in the upcoming cycle for the RENA allocation. So cycle 5, that column 2013 to 21 is what we're in right now. Cycle 6 is the next cycle, 2021 through 2029. You can see how the increase is substantial. Overall, about a 53%, 54% increase in the regional housing needs allocation. And this is what we're using as the basis for the housing element update. A lot of the programs and policies that we're developing are really trying to address this cycle 6 number, and it's going to be a challenge. Next slide, please. So the last couple of years, we've been providing updates on implementation measures in the general plan. We've done land use in 2018, last year, 2019, and we did conservation and safety, both of those two elements. This year, we focused on the agricultural element, which is the left set of bars on this chart. And so one of the attachments is the implementation measure status report. It shows in detail, measure by measure, what's been done. And for the ag element, we've identified a number of implementation measures that have been completed. Some 5, I think, policies or implementation measures that have some progress but are not yet completed. And then the red bar is the implementation measures that have not been completed or there's no progress. And so we've identified a couple of issues, and this is not solely for the ag element, but it's probably true for a lot of the other elements. There can be a lack of knowledge or awareness within the county, as there's sometimes institutional knowledge that's lost over time. The second issue is the age of the general plan itself. A lot of these implementation measures were not really changed substantially when we did the 2011 general plan update. And then third is just the sheer number of policies and implementation measures. Frankly, as staff, it can be challenging sometimes to go through the general plan in any level of detail given the number of policies and measures. So we've identified that as an issue with implementation, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So growth is one of the major topics in our general plan that is really tackled in a couple of different strategies. And just for context, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG, is projecting growth of about 37,000 units by 2040, so roughly 19 years from now. And that figure gets updated every 4 years when SACOG goes through the Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy update. So the county has three main growth strategies. The first is infill development, which is really focusing on either vacant or underutilized property. We can tackle roughly 10 to 18,000 units in that category, depending on geography. The second way we look at infill is through revitalizing some of the commercial corridors. There were 14 commercial corridors identified in the general plan update. Several of those have adopted corridor plans associated with them. For example, the North Watt Avenue corridor plan or Fair Oaks Boulevard corridor plan. Between all of those, there's an estimate of about 19,000 dwelling units that could be accommodated there. And I mentioned earlier, one of the plans that we're working on is called Re-Envision West Arden Arcade. This is along Arden Way from Watt Avenue on the east end, and on the west end looking at about Howe Avenue or thereabouts, and then a certain distance north and south of that corridor to try to get a holistic approach to what that area might look like in the future. This is one of our environmental justice communities in the county that we're trying to identify new ways for transportation infrastructure to be more effective and serve the community needs. I also want to mention the Green Means Go program. This is a SACOG pilot program that is dependent on state funding, but we did identify 5 green zones is what they're called, or priority areas for infill development in the unincorporated county. So we are tracking the status of that program through SACOG and any budget allocation that comes out of the state to hopefully incentivize infill development in some of those corridors. The other way that the county can accommodate growth is in approved growth areas. We can do roughly 53,700 units in some of those areas. And I do want to mention something that our peers at the Department of Transportation have been working on here. In the Vineyard community area, we have 3 approved master plans that all are based on what are called triggers for roadway infrastructure. And what they've done is taken a more nuanced approach to those old triggers that were developed, in the late 90s and early 2000s with those plans, and tried to figure out a way that would be more economically feasible to deliver those projects using a portion of development funds and county transportation dollars to effectively deliver those transportation projects. And that is going to the board, I believe, tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And then the third way that the county can accommodate new growth is with new growth areas, or what we're calling here pending master plans. We've got about 55,000 dwelling units in the pending master plans. Next slide, please. So just to give some raw numbers to you, this is strictly residential units in the approved growth areas. Obviously, there are non-residential uses with all of these projects, but just so you have a sense of where these numbers are coming from. So approved growth areas, 48,500 plus Rancho Murrieta gets us up to that 53,000 number. And then next slide, please. In the pending master plans, we've got about 55,000 dwelling units, and these 4 are the ones that are remaining. The 2 in Jackson Highway Corridor are Jackson Township and the West Jackson Plan. And then the 2 in the Natomas Joint Vision area are Grand Park and Upper West Side. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail on our work program for this year, 2021. We're going to continue with our environmental justice element implementation work. There's a lot to do there. I already spoke about the climate action plan. We are hoping to get that in front of the Planning Commission and the board later this summer. We have a funding coming in through the local early action planning grant, or the LEAP grant. We have identified some infill programs as part of that grant fund. The housing element update I mentioned earlier, we're hoping to have that to the Planning Commission and board, the board by July, so the Planning Commission probably a month or two before then. And then the SB2 planning grant, again, hoping to have that in front of the Planning Commission and board later this year. I do want to mention the Housing Trust Fund Nexus study. This is the affordable housing fee that is for non-residential development. Some of you may be familiar with the affordable housing ordinance that is for residential. This particular trust fund has not been updated since the early 90s. So we started completing a Nexus study and an ordinance update on that. The Green Means Go program, we have applied for that at the end of 2019, obviously, or excuse me, 2020, but that is dependent on state budget allocation, so we'll continue tracking that. And if that does come to fruition, then we can use some of those dollars for incentivizing infill, as I mentioned earlier. The Re-Envision West Arden Arcade plan, continuing the conversation there with our Department of Transportation to try to wrap that up by the end of this year. West of Watt, I've got a later slide on that, so I'll skip that for now. The Vineyard area transportation triggers, depending on how the workshop goes tomorrow at the board, there may be some follow-up effort needed to refine those triggers and then make any necessary changes to the plans themselves and how we structure their respective conditions of approval. And then this policy AG5 is a reference to a policy in the agricultural element, and I mention it here because that's the element that we focused on implementation for this year. This policy is of interest because it says that projects that are impacting prime or statewide importance farmlands and a few other local importance or other types, mitigation may be accomplished through certain habitat types that are set aside through the county adopted HCP. And now that the South Sac HCP is in place, we are seeing implementation of that policy occurring through the South Sac HCP, but there may be some instances where it's appropriate to have separate ag mitigation depending on the context of the project and whether that ag land, for example, is of prime designation or statewide importance designation. So that's a continued discussion with the ag community that we expect to take place in 2021. Next slide, please. So this slide and the next one are a little bit of more detail on a couple of general plan policy topics. This one is LU 32 as it relates to transit service and specifically in the Metro Air Park special planning area. And so staff have identified the issue being that there's a potential conflict between the floor area ratios in the Metro Air Park SPA and then the minimum FARs in general plan policy LU 32, which has to do with proximity to a light rail station. And so for those who don't know, there's a planned or an optional light rail station within the Metro Air Park special planning area. It's part of the regional transit Green Line or the downtown Natomas Airport line. The board did adopt some modified floor area ratios in the Metro Air Park special planning area. This is under option 1 that we've identified. The board may consider that to meet the intent. And we have a pending planning director determination that we'll be presenting to the board tomorrow, or excuse me, Wednesday, when they hear this annual report. The second option, which is what staff is recommending, which is an amendment to the to the SPA, which is a resolution that's included in your package, that would identify an alternative approach specifically for the Metro Air Park SPA that would specify lower floor area ratios for some areas that are further away or less proximate to that light rail platform, but an alternative metric, whether that's a floor area ratio or something else, that would facilitate those uses with higher ridership in closer proximity to the platform. So that is staff's recommendation, and the board will take that up on Wednesday, as I said. Next slide, please. So this is the west of Watt bullet that was on a couple of slides ago. So in our general plan and the land use element, we've got an area called west of Watt, generally located north. It's in the North Highlands community, so north and east of the Mcclellan former Air Force Base. It was identified as an area for proactive planning in the general plan and in the North Watt Avenue corridor plan. There are a number of properties that have an urban development area designation. It's a land use designation in the general plan that specifically says in its definition that rezones cannot be approved, rezones for urban development cannot be approved in the absence of a master plan. And the intent, again, was to do a more comprehensive planning effort in that geographic area with the understanding that there was going to be an update to the Mcclellan Comprehensive Land Use Plan. Again, this is 10 years ago. So that Mcclellan Comprehensive Land Use Plan has not been updated. That's an activity that is beyond the county's control. That's something that the Sacramento Area Council of Governments does. And so in the meantime, there's been a couple of applications coming in, specifically in an area that's in the northwest portion of the west of Watt area, as we call it. It's roughly about 75, 77 acres. Staff is recommending that this application, we call it Antelope Acres, be processed as a simplified master plan. Again, it's inside the urban policy area, so those growth, new growth policies in LU 119 and LU 120 don't strictly apply like they do for the projects that are really new growth outside the urban policy area. So the project would complete all the necessary technical studies, sewer, water, drainage, transportation, etc. But we do see it as a simplified master plan process. Then the second property that we want to call out is about 1.9 acres. It's in the southern portion of the west of Watt area, but it has access to infrastructure, sewer and water supply infrastructure, right out in front of the property on I Street. But it doesn't have a real good path to rezone in the absence of a larger master plan because of that, the policy language, excuse me, not the policy, the definition of the urban development area says that in the absence of a master plan, rezones for urban development cannot be accommodated. So staff is recommending that the board initiate an amendment to the text of the urban development area designation that would allow for rezones of certain small projects where infrastructure and services are available. We see this as beneficial given that there hasn't been a comprehensive planning effort due to the lack of forward progress on the Mcclellan CLUP and the lack of available funds for the county to do comprehensive planning in this area. Next slide, please. So our recommendations are to receive and file this annual report, and then I included these other recommendations as an FYI for the planning commissioners. These are all board actions that we would anticipate the board might take when we do present this on Wednesday. So it's directing staff to submit the annual report to Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the State Department of Housing and Community Development. That's something we do every year. The deadline is April 1st. And then obviously directing us to proceed with implementation, including those projects outlined in the work program. And then those two resolutions, which we anticipate some discussion of by the board related to West of Watt and the LU32 and Metro Air Park SPA floor area ratio. And I believe this concludes my presentation, and I can take any questions.
Do we have any questions, staff? Todd?
So this is Leanne Moffett. I did have one additional piece of information I wanted to share that I hadn't had a chance to talk to Todd about is during the board briefings today, headed to the board hearing on Wednesday, there has been a request for us to continue the piece on LU32 into April at the board. Clearly, if you have any comments or questions on that, that would be great for tonight. But just in case any members of the public are listening, it does look like that the board will not take any particular action on the resolution 2 at Wednesday's hearing.
Okay. Are there any questions? Do you have any public comments on this item?
No, there are no verbal or written public comments.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd. We'll call the next
Thank
item
you,
on the
commissioners.
Okay, and for item number 3 is the planning director's report.
Good evening, commissioners. This is Chris Bahuli. I don't have a report per se. I do just want to note that we do have a number of items that you considered at fairly recent meetings that are going to be heard by the board on Wednesday afternoon. Those include the Grubbs Bell Aqua rezone and map. It includes Wild Hawk 9, again, rezone and map. The Carmichael Generations Project, general plan amendment, among other entitlements, and a couple of other items that are going to the board, in addition to the general plan update that Todd Smith just provided. So a busy day at the board on Wednesday. We'll keep you updated at your next meeting about the outcome on those items. And that concludes my report.
All right, thank you. Any miscellaneous scheduling matters?
Nothing on my end. We do have items lined up for the next few meetings, so I would expect that we will not be canceling any upcoming meetings.
Good. And do we have any overall public comments?
Nope, there are none.
All right, well, with that, we'll call the meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.